Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to focus on one of the most famous, one of the most influential thinkers from ancient Greece. A writer, a thinker, a statesman, an educator named Plato, whose works have gone on to influence Western thinking and Western philosophy for the last 2,400 years. He lived in around 400 BCE in ancient Greece. His teacher was Socrates, who was also extraordinarily famous both then and now as being a person constantly after the truth, I think would be the best way to think about him. And Plato's student, Aristotle, another very famous thinker, writer, philosopher, kind of set the groundwork for what would later emerge as scientific revolutions that followed. So all three of these guys, very, very influential, very, very famous, and we're going to look at probably the most famous piece of writing from Plato, which is the Allegory of the Cave. And one of the reasons why it's so famous and so relevant even to today, 2,400 years later, is the incredible questions that he lays out that have applications for everybody. What he's primarily concerned about is, what's the world that we're living in? What's the real world? How do we see it? How do we come to know it? And once we know it, what are we supposed to do about that? So these are the three essential questions that Plato lays out throughout the Allegory of the Cave, and what he's trying to kind of tackle as he goes through them. There are a couple things that I need to point out in terms of the way that the piece is written. So take note, this is an allegory. It's the Allegory of the Cave. An allegory is a complex metaphor that's extended over the entire course of a story. Each level of the metaphor is just crammed with symbols that create meaning at every level. So you've got a metaphorical level, lots of symbols that populate it, and they tell a story. And another level of the metaphor, and it has symbols, and it tells a story. And another metaphor, and another level of symbols. And all of these are connected by the overall structure of the allegory. You might think of an allegory as a bit like an office building. At each level of the office building, there's a business, and each one of the businesses has people, and they're all kind of working and doing their job. And you could look at each individual business and say, okay, this is the story that this business tells, and this is the story that this business tells, and this is the story that this business tells. And then you could look at the entire structure of the building and all the stories together and say, what is the story of this building? And that's a bit about how the allegory works. It's the entire metaphorical structure of the story and a number of complex meanings that can come out of that. There's no real one straightforward meaning that you can grant or you can gather. So a good, more modern example of this would be George Orwell's Animal Farm. This is the story of a farm, literal farm, and the animals that live on it. They overthrow the farmer that takes care of them, but doesn't do a very good job of it. They think what he does is oppressive and violent, so they kick him off. They create their own rules, but they end up basically creating a horrible, failed system that's potentially worse than the system that they had under the farmer. And this loosely is to tell the story of the Russian Revolution in the early 1900s. That, you know, you had this state, and it was ruled by a czar. The people decided that, it's very complicated, but the people decided that they wanted to liberate themselves from this form of rule, and they established another one. But in fact, it was corrupt and bureaucratic, and it ended violently and bloodily in much the same way that Animal Farm does. So, that's allegory. The other thing to note about the way that this is told is it's told as a dialogue. All of Plato's writings are told as dialogues between his teacher Socrates and Socrates' students, in this case Glaucon. These are meant to do is they're meant to show that this is not just like one person talking down at a group of people, but as a group of people working together to try to understand a deeper truth. So it's two people or more coming together to develop truth together in a dialogic process. So they're constantly communicating, reinforcing, asking questions, and so on, in order to build a more convincing case. Because what's going to be more convincing? Someone just berating you with knowledge and telling you this is the way it is, or you working together with that person and then coming to a greater understanding. And that's why I wanted to pose these as kinds of questions that we're going to work out more clearly in class. So we've got allegory and we've got the fact that it's a dialogue. So in order to try to understand this, what's I think most helpful for me, I'm a visual learner. I think it's easier for me to try to picture these things rather than just to take the words in. So while we're reading together, what I'd like you to try to do is I'd like you to try to visualize the allegory that Plato is telling. What does it look like? And as we're going along, and you're reading along with me, so make sure that you have your copy of Plato's Allegory of the Cave with you, and we'll read it together. But pause occasionally and draw what you see. And we'll take a short break in the middle after Socrates explains exactly what the allegory is for you to fully draw that out. Please make sure you draw that out and come with it to class. Last. Once we finish, I'd like you to try to tackle these three questions. What do the different symbols represent? What meaning can you find in this combination of symbols? And is the allegory mode effective at conveying a meaning? So remember, allegory is a complex metaphor that's populated with symbols. Think about what those symbols are. What do those different symbols represent? Okay, from there, what's the meaning, right? Remember the office building, the overall structure. What's the meaning of this combination of symbols? What's he ultimately driving at? And then finally, one of the things that we've got to get good at is we've got to get good at critique and finding maybe anything that is not fully developed. Plato's a great thinker. He's been influential for 2,400 years. But like me, like you, he's a human being. And human beings are capable of not just mistakes, but not perfect knowledge. So where is it that you might find a mistake? Is it in the fact that it's an allegory? Is it in the fact that it's a dialogue? Or is it in something else? Maybe there's something else that you might find that's problematic. So if the allegory mode you think is perfect for this type of conversation, say so. But following that, can you find anywhere that you might critique Plato? Because there have certainly been critiques, and not the least of which is from this book over here. But you may find your own critiques, and I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say. So, with that in mind, let's go ahead and dive into the text and see what meaning we can derive from Plato's Allegory of the Cave. So remember, starting out as a dialogue. So we're starting with Socrates talking here. And he says, "And now, I said, let me show in a figure how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Behold, human beings living in an underground cave, which has a mouth open towards the light, and reaching all along the cave, here they have been from their childhood, and have their legs and necks chained, so that they cannot move, and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning their heads. Above and behind them is a fire blazing at a distance, and between the fire and the prisoners there is a raised way, a raised wall. And you will see, if you look, a low wall built along the way, like the screen which marionette players have in front of them over which they show the puppets. Now, we don't have marionette players in modernity too much, but if you might imagine, okay, you've got the cave and a cave wall. You've got your prisoners, they're chained looking at the cave wall. Behind them, there's a wall and a raised way separating the prisoners from this other area where marionette players walk with their, or use their various implements to move along the wall. And then behind that is a fire. So try to imagine kind of what that looks like, and if there's anything in modern society that may look like what we're trying to describe, and we'll keep going. Glaucon says, I see. And do you see, I said, men passing along the wall carrying all sorts of vessels and statues and figures of animals made of wood and stone and various materials which appear over the wall? Some of them are talking, others silent. You have shown me a strange image, and they are strange prisoners, like ourselves, I replied. And they see only their shadows, or the shadows of one another, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave. Okay, so think about that. The fire is throwing these shadows along the wall, kind of like a screen projecting images. What might that look like? True, he said. How could they see anything but the shadows if they were never allowed to move their heads? And of the objects which are being carried in like manner, they would only see the shadows. Yes, Glaucon says. And if they were able to converse with one another, would they not suppose that they are naming what was actually before them? It's very true. They would think that what they see is the real thing. And suppose further that the prison had an echo which came from the other side, would they not be sure to fancy when one of the passers-by spoke that the voice which they heard came from the passing shadow? No question, he replied. To them, I said, the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of the images. That is certain. And now look again, and we see what will naturally follow if the prisoners are released. So if one guy gets released and disabused of this error, so it's corrected, it's disabused. At first, when any of them is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck round and walk and look towards the light, he will suffer sharp pains. The glare will distress him, and he will be unable to see the realities of which in his former state he had seen the shadows, and then conceive someone saying to him that what he saw before was an illusion, but that now, when he is approaching nearer to being and his eye is turned toward more real existence, he has a clearer vision. What will be his reply? And you may further imagine that this instructor is pointing to the object as they pass and requiring him to name them. Will he not be perplexed? Will he not fancy that the shadows which he formerly saw are truer than the objects which are now shown to him? So you've got this guy who's coming up and he's looking around at these new objects that appear differently than they had formerly. They're not the shadows that he's familiar with. They're the objects that we see in this above-ground world. How would they appear to this former prisoner? Well, they would be totally perplexing. He couldn't name them. He would have no idea what they are, even if he was asked by this guide. And Glaucon says far truer. And if he is compelled to look straight at the light, will he not have a pain in his eyes which will make him turn away to take in the object of vision which he can see, and which he will conceive to be in reality clearer than the things which are now being shown to him? True, Glaucon says. And suppose once more that he is reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent, and held fast until he's forced into the presence of the sun himself. Is he not likely to be pained and irritated? When he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he will not be able to see anything at all of what are now called realities. So imagine you're dragged out of a dark underground location. And you're forced to look at all of these things. Not only will you be confused, your eyes will be pained and irritated because they're not adjusted to the light. If he's dragged up a hill and put in the presence of the sun, it's going to be far worse. He's going to be utterly confused. And he's going to have no idea what's going on. He's going to have no idea what's really going on. And Glaucon says, not in a moment. And Socrates says, yeah, he will require to grow accustomed to the sight of the upper world. And first he will see the shadows best, next the reflections of men and other objects in the water, and then the objects himself. Now, this is very important. Then he will gaze upon the light of the moon and the stars and the spangled heaven, and he will see the sky and the stars by night better than the sun or the light of the sun by day. So this is a fascinating idea. What Plato is essentially saying is that we're first going to see the shadows of the thing, then the reflections of them, and then the things themselves. So there's this layering. And so I want to see what you think about this, and I'm going to use an example that's ready. So take, for example, this Samsung Fire. And it's projecting an image, it's not anymore. It was projecting and will be soon an image of Plato and his student Aristotle, or at least a representation of the two, in the Academy as done by Raphael. So great painting. And what I want you to think about is you have this iPad, yeah? Or I guess it's a Samsung Fire. And you might think, well, I can see this. I see the device and I know what it is. That's what we're used to thinking, that we see objects. But what Plato says is, no, you don't see objects. What you see is what you want to see. So what I see when I look at this is an opportunity to look at an object, look at an image, maybe read a book, maybe watch a movie, maybe do some research, maybe surf on the web. And maybe if I get really curious, I might look on the Wikipedia page and learn about what the Samsung Fire is. And so that might be the reflection. So first is the shadow. What my desires for this thing are. Then I might learn a little bit about the history of the thing. The fact that it can connect to this thing called the internet. The fact that it's made of certain parts. But in order to see the thing as it is itself, I would need to know all of those parts, how they work together, how they interact with other parts and other Samsung Fires and other technological innovations like smartphones and computers and smartwatches and all other instruments that connect to the internet. And so to see an object in itself is very complicated. And that's Plato's point here, is that when you see an object, you don't see the object that you think you see. You see some reflection of that object that you want to see, that you're trained to see, that you're used to seeing, that's convenient for you to see. Because to see the whole object, well, Jesus, that's to see the entire working structure of this iPad and every other instrument that's connected to it. And that's like to see the whole world. And so it's very difficult to see a thing. And that's a very influential idea, and it's one that's carried over even into modern technologies when we're trying to develop artificial intelligence that can, quote unquote, see and recognize and create patterns. It's very hard for even modern science to be able to do that. So maybe Plato was onto something here. I'd be very fascinated to hear what you all have to say in class. So Glaucon continues, certainly. Last of all, he will be able to see the sun, and not mere reflections of him in the water, but he will see him in his own proper place, and not in another, and he will contemplate him as he is. So once we're able to see all the objects in the world as they are, then we'll be able to see what is good. What is the sun? Certainly, Glaucon says. He will then proceed to argue that this is he, the sun, who gives the season and the years, and he is the guardian of all that is in the visible world, and in a certain way the cause of all things, which he and his fellows have been accustomed to behold. Clearly, he said, he would first see the sun and then reason about him. And when he remembered his old habitation and the wisdom of the cave and his fellow prisoners, how do you not suppose that he would felicitate himself on the change and pity them? So felicitate, a good vocabulary word for you, is to celebrate, or congratulate. Certainly, he would. And if they were in the habit of conferring honors among themselves on those who were quickest to observe the passing shadows and to remark which of them went before and which followed after, and which were together, and who were therefore best able to draw conclusions as to the future, do you think that he would care for such honors and glories or envy possessors of them? Would he not say with Homer, better to be the poor servant of a poor master and to endure anything rather than think as they do and live in their manner? So this is a fabulous quote, and it comes from the sequel to one of the books that we had looked at previously. This is the Odyssey now by Homer, not the Iliad. It's the story of one of the characters that we read about before, named Odysseus, and this is Odysseus's journey back home. Odysseus is trying to get back home to his family after the incredible events of the Trojan War. Troy fell, everybody went home except for a few, more than a few, that died, including, we remember, Achilles. Achilles, the great hero that wouldn't fight until the very end, and then he slew Hector. He dies. He dies on the battlefields of Troy. And one of the parts in the Odyssey, when Odysseus is trying to get back home, is he has to go to the underworld and get some directions, because he gets blown off course a bunch of times. But he has to go down and get directions on how to get back home from a blind fortune teller, or a blind seer, named Tiresias. And while he's down there, he encounters some of his old comrades, Achilles and Agamemnon and so on. And he's talking to them. Now, you gotta imagine that this guy's pretty freaked out because he's in the middle of hell and he's talking to ghosts. And these are the ghosts of the greatest warriors in ancient Greece. And he's gotta basically kind of like schmooze with them. He's gotta like talk them up a little bit in order to basically escape out of there alive. Not a friendly and hospitable place. And so he's trying to use all his cunning and all of his great storytelling ability, and he's talking to Achilles now, and he says, you know, hey, we love you, we still love you, you're the most honored of all the Greeks, you should count yourself lucky. And this is the wrong thing to say to Achilles, as many things that Odysseus says to Achilles are the wrong things to say to Achilles. And Achilles basically slaps him and says, look, you don't know what you're talking about. He says, don't try to sell me on death, Odysseus. I'd rather be a hired hand back up on earth, slaving away for some poor dirt farmer, than lord it over all these withered dead. So this is the line that Homer is drawing from. He's saying, yo, listen, don't pretend that living in this underground world of ignorance and death is preferable, even if you're the king of that underground world, to living as the poorest of the poor in the land of the true and the just. And so I challenge you with that idea as well. What do you think? Because there have been many who have disagreed with that, and famously disagreed with it. Most notably, probably, is the character of Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost, who says, "I would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven." Well, Plato is saying the opposite, and Achilles is saying the opposite. And I'm curious to hear what you have to say. Glaucon says yes, and Glaucon agrees too. Yes, he said, "I think that he would rather suffer anything than entertain these false notions and live in this miserable manner. Imagine once more," I said, "such a one coming suddenly out of the sun to be replaced in his old situation. Would he not be certain to have his eyes full of darkness?" So you're going back down into that dark realm. You're going to have your eyes full of darkness. "To be sure," says Glaucon. "And if there were a contest, and he had to compete in measuring the shadows with the prisoners who had never moved out of the cave, while his sight was still weak, and before his eyes had become steady, and the time which would be needed to acquire this new habit of sight might be very considerable, would he not be ridiculous? Would he not seem like a blind person coming back down into this world of darkness and be unable to see? Men would say of him that up he went and down he came without his eyes, and that it was better not even to think of ascending. And if anyone tried to loose another and lead him up to the light, let them only catch the offender, and they would put him to death." So, look, you go up, you see, you get blinded, you come back down, you're blind, you can't see, you can't recognize. Better not to learn. Better not to see the world as it really is. Well, what do you think about that idea? Glaucon says there's no question that it would be worse. And now Socrates kind of concludes his argument with the allegory. And so after this, we're going to pause, and you're going to take some time to see if you might be able to finish up your drawing and your visualization of it. "This entire allegory," I said, "you may now append, dear Glaucon, to the previous argument. The prison house is the world of sight. The light of fire is the sun. And you will not misapprehend me if you interpret the journey upwards to be the ascent of the soul into the intellectual world according to my poor belief, which, at your desire, I have expressed, whether rightly or wrongly, God knows. But whether true or false, my opinion is that in the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all, and is seen only with an effort, and when seen, is also inferred to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right, parent of light and of the Lord of light in this visible world, and the immediate source of reason and truth in the intellectual. And this is the power upon which he who would act rationally, either in public or private life, must have his eye fixed." Go back now and try to finish that drawing. Take a look at this section again. Think about what the different aspects of the allegory represent. What are those different metaphorical layers? What are the different symbols? Try to represent them as best you can. And we'll pick up with this when we get back.